Hi, my name is Tim Paulitz and I'm the plot coordinator, and I've been on the board of Pullman Community Garden for about the last 20 years, and I've also gardened here for that same period of time. And what we'd like to do today is to shoot a video that will provide orientation information for new gardeners, but also be a resource to the rest of the community. Normally we would have done this in person, but because of COVID, last year we had to do it on Zoom. But this year I hope we can make it a little bit more informative by going around the garden and seeing some things. So what I'd like to do today is to start with a short history, talk about the mission of the garden. We'll walk around and show you some of our facilities. I'll talk about how we garden organically and manage our weeds. And then I'll give some suggestions on what types of plants to and when to plant and where to plant because of the special needs of this garden. And then finally talk about water conservation, which is very important. So we're in front of a sign that was actually painted, a mural by a pretty well-known Pullman artist, Pat Seiler. He's actually also a gardener. And so we put this up about 5 or 6 years ago. We have about 100 plots on the garden, about 3 acres altogether. Most of them are 20 by 20 plots, which we rent for $65 a year, and then the 10 by 10 plots are $32.50. And that's our main source of financial support. We're all volunteer. We're a 501c3. We don't have any paid staff. We have about 10 board members, and so that money we use to pay the lease on the property and also water and other expenses. So that's very important that we have that support. But I should also mention that we also have a lot of financial support from the community. So for example, we've been supported by United Way the last few years. We've gotten grants from the Rotary Club, from Meter to pay for a drip irrigation system. And then we'll talk about our ADA wheelchair accessible plot that we're developing there with support from some other groups like Innovia and Meter. And then we have lots of community partners. In fact, the person filming this is part of that Palouse Conservation District. We'll show you some of their efforts down here. We also work with Community Action Center and Backyard Harvest for the food plots. Work with WSU Center for Civic Engagement, Pullman Parks and Rec. They help us maintain some of the outlying areas and pay for the porta potty. And then just over the years, lots of other schools and other community groups. So this is really a community resource, not just for the garden. We recognize that the initial stewards of this land, of course, were our native and indigenous people, part of the Palouse tribe. And this is on the by the South Fork of the Palouse River, which is over here. So probably was inhabited as a settlement. It probably was a wetland. Probably camas would have been growing here. In the early 1900s, it was a dairy farm that was started by an immigrant couple from Switzerland. And then later their son and Franz, and then he married Selma Koppel, operated this as a dairy farm for most of the 20th century. And they were instrumental in helping this property to become the community garden. So what happened was in the early 1990s, there was a group called the Greystone Foundation that were looking for a project to do. And so this was established, the water system was put in, the shed was built. We'll look at that in a minute. And then it's been a community garden ever since. The other thing about it is it's not just a garden, but it's also a resource for the entire community, really like a nature refuge. Because of the fact that we're organic, we have lots of pollinators, bumblebees, cavity bees, regular bees, lots of insects, butterflies, etc. And we have a lot of wildlife. We have a lot of birds down here, blue jays, chickadees, the whole list of songbirds. Even some blue herons over in the river. And then we have a lot of coyotes, beavers down at the river, and even a lot of deer. So we have like a resident herd of deer that's taken up residence the last 10 years on this Pioneer Hill. And when we go through the garden, you'll see a lot of people have put up fences to keep the deer from feeding. So it's important to remember that this is really a resource for the entire community. A few of our mission points, principles that I'd like to emphasize. First of all, we're managed organically, and I'll talk about how we can do that later, but that's a major principle of the garden. We don't use any pesticides, fungicides, insecticides, or fertilizers, or inorganic fertilizers. Second thing is we work together on common tasks, and so it's important that all of our gardeners put a few hours a month into these common tasks. Otherwise the garden would not run. So that communal part of it is very important. And then the third thing is we put a lot of emphasis on education. Over the season we have different talks and different groups that do that. So with that, we'll go ahead and take a look at some of the facilities we have. Okay, this first stop is our garden shed, and it was actually built based on a design from the late 1800s. It's called a post and beam structure. And so it was actually assembled without any metal hangers. It was all done with wooden dowels the way they would have done it over 100 years ago. And in this shed, this is where we keep all of our hand tools, and we also have some lawnmower and tillers and some other things. The lawnmowers and tillers and all the power tools are only for the mowing committee and the tilling committee. They're not available to the general gardeners, so we keep those locked up, but you're certainly welcome to bring any of your own power tools or whatever to the garden, electric weed whackers, etc. Okay, this is a small greenhouse that was donated to us about 10 years ago from somebody on Pioneer Hill, and then we hauled it down here, and this can be used by growers and gardeners during the beginning of the season for starts. It doesn't have any fan, and so it's probably not useful later on in the season. People have to come here every morning and open and close the vents, but that's another facility people can use. Okay, these are our composts, and this is where we throw all the weeds and other debris that we want to recycle from the garden. And it's in a bit of disarray right now. We haven't turned it in about a year and a half because of COVID, but we're going to get a tractor in here and rotate these rows. And the way that this works is this pile here is the one where we are going to be active this year, where we put all of our debris, and everybody can concentrate on putting the debris there. And then we're going to rotate these piles, so we'll have a second last year, and then the far one toward the river there is the final one, which has been composting for about 3 years. And you're welcome to take soil from that composted plot and put it back on your garden, because what's happened over the years is people have weeded so much, they've taken the soil with the weeds, dumped them on the plot, and then the soil level has declined in some of these plots. And in fact, you can see some of them have actually gone down about 3 or 4 inches. So we encourage people to bring the soil back. We also have a pile of soil from the ADA garden that we saved on the other side of the picnic structure, and that can also be used to bring soil back to the plots. Okay, this is our latest project that we're working on, an ADA wheelchair handicapped accessible garden. And this is being built by WSU Landscape Architecture class with Michael Sanchez. But we received funding from Inovia and also from Meter, a local company here in town, which has provided some funding. And then we hope to get some funding from the Rees Foundation. So the idea is that we'll have pavers on this whole surface here that wheelchairs can go on, and then we'll have raised beds in the center of it that a wheelchair can pull up to and can be completely accessible. This area here is going to be a place where they can back in and unload their wheelchairs, etc. Our long-term plan is to get funding for a sidewalk that would go from the handicapped spot over there all the way out here, so they could park in the parking lot. And then the city of Pullman's also been very cooperative with us. They've set up the handicapped spot, and then they've also switched over the porta potty to a handicapped accessible. So stay tuned for that. It's probably going to be in the fall by the time we finish that. But that's been a big project that we think there's a real need. And we're working also with Northwest Disability Action Group, Action Network with Vicki Lieber. So we have a lot of buy-in from different community groups. This will be the first ADA accessible garden outside of Coeur d'Alene in this area. Okay, this is our picnic shelter, and this was also designed and built by WSU students about 10 years ago. It was a construction engineering class, and they had a design competition, and this was the one that we chose, and then they went ahead and built it. So this is a great facility for different community groups, gardeners to sit under when it gets too hot. And then you can also see that we got 3 new picnic tables this year to supplement the other 3 that we had. So everybody can feel free to use that. And then before COVID, we used to have socials under here. I'll talk about that later, potlucks, etc. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we manage pests down here organically. And if we look at the 3 main pests in gardens, diseases, insects, and weeds, we'll start out first of all with weeds, which are with diseases which are the least problem. And I'm a plant pathologist by training, and I have very rarely encountered any major diseases down here. Occasionally we get some powdery mildew. The other problem is damping off of seeds, and since we can't treat our seeds with chemicals, a lot of times they would damp off before they came up. So what I do is I just germinate them in my house in vermiculite and then transplant them. So if you have any disease that's a problem where the seed doesn't come up, you can always start it in your house and then transplant it. The second problem is insects, and again, we don't have very major problems with that, and that's probably because we manage it organically and we have large populations of parasitoids, natural enemies, etc. that control these insects. In fact, we have a resident population of ladybugs every winter. In the springtime, we can see them with their nests overwintering in the weeds, and so that keeps a lot of the insect populations down. The only ones we've really had problems with are flea beetle on crucifers and also cabbage moths, and the solution for that is to use row coverings, which will protect those quite well. We also have some problems with pea weevils and then some occasional aphids, but with most of these insects, the plants outgrow it. You know, they might cause a lot of damage early on, but then once they get past that stage, they're good. And the other thing people can use is diatomaceous earth, which you can sprinkle around your plants, and that does a good job of controlling crawling insects. So we've got lots of organic and biological ways of controlling those. Then that brings us to the weeds, and I would say that this is the biggest problem, and this is what you will be spending 90% of your time on. And the real problems are two weeds that are perennial, and they put down rhizomes which survive year after year. One of them is morning glory or bindweed, which is just starting to come out now. And this one produces a lot of rhizomes. These are probably coming up from very deep. And so this one is very difficult to control. In fact, I don't even see, well, there we go. Yeah, you can see some of the rhizomes there. So you can see these rhizomes that they use. The other one is quackgrass, and that's also a perennial. I see some of it over here, and let's see if we can find some rhizomes on this one. Yeah, you can kind of see where the plant started. And so that can survive year after year. So that's probably our two biggest weeds. Oh, the only other perennial we have is dandelion, and this one is also very easy to control because it just has one taproot. Dig it up and it's gone. The other semi-perennial weed we have, and I don't see any of them here, is Canada thistle. And that one also has a long taproot, and that can be easily managed. So then the question is how to manage weeds. First of all, a lot of people come in here with the rototill in the very beginning of the season to try and get back, especially a plot that's been sodded over or has lots of grass. And in fact, we can look at a plot behind us that's been tilled. And the thing about that is it's a good way of starting out, but it's not the whole solution, because what you're doing is you're breaking up all those rhizomes of the bindweed and the quackgrass, so you're essentially creating lots of new weeds. And so you're going to have to go in there throughout the rest of the season and try to manage them by hoeing them, etc. So that's one thing. The other thing I'll mention about rototilling is that I try to avoid it as much as possible because it really does a number on the soil. Destroys the tilth, destroys aggregation, reduces organic matter, and in fact my plot has not been rototilled for probably a decade. The other thing it does by not rototilling is encouraging earthworms, and there's huge earthworm populations down here, and you really want to encourage that as much as possible. So then what you can do is during the season, just every once a week come out here with a hoe and just hoe anything that comes up, and that will be another good way of controlling the weeds, but you have to keep at it week after week. You can't abandon the plot for 2 or 3 weeks, come back, and it'll just be completely overgrown. Another thing that I've seen people use is different kinds of barriers, and this also has its pluses and minuses. For example, people have tried plastic, and I discourage this because all these barrier things are really stopgap measure. People think, I'm going to put a barrier down, I'm not going to have to weed. And so people have tried plastic. There's problems with that in terms of disposal. In fact, we had one of our members a few years ago, Doug Young, did an experiment. He took a plot and covered it with plastic. And then once a year, we'd open it up and look at the bindweed. So after 1 year, bindweed's still there. After 2 years, bindweed's still there. After 3 years, bindweed's still there. So you really can't eliminate it. Another thing that people will do, and it's a lot more labor, is to actually hand dig the weeds and shake off the soil and put them on the compost pile. That would be a good solution, again, to remove as many of these rhizomes as possible, but it's a lot of work. Now, the other thing that people will often do for barriers, I've seen a lot of people bring cardboard down here, and I'm also a little bit leery of that because we have a problem here because we don't have any trash service. Okay, we don't have any disposal service, and what happens every year is that people put garbage like cardboard on their plots, and then they leave, even though we tell them to clean the plots up. And then the next season we have to have a work party and haul truckloads of garbage to the dump. So if you do want to use cardboard, and I see some people have started to use it, be respectful and remove that cardboard at the end of the season. I've also seen people use weed mulches, which would also be a good alternative. And then finally in my garden, which we can look at toward the end here, I use straw in between the rows of garlic, and that's also a pretty effective method, straws and other types of mulches to try to keep the weeds down. So bottom line is weeds are going to be the most difficult to control, but you just have to keep working at them. And then the other thing is, of course, you're able to keep plots for many years here if you'd like to. Once you get a plot that's pretty free of weeds and maintain it free of weeds, then you won't have much of a problem following that. Okay, I'd like to talk about water conservation because this is something that's very important to our garden. It turns out that this is probably our major expense. We also pay, unfortunately, higher water rates with the city than businesses or homeowners. And so there's been a few years where we've actually run into the red because of excessive water use. And so for the last few years, we've really made an effort to try to educate people about water conservation. And we got a grant from Meter last year that will fund drip irrigation systems for gardeners. So that if you're interested in that, please contact us. So the mistake that a lot of new gardeners make is shallow watering. They'll come out here with the hose and spray, and then the water only goes down so far, and it encourages the plants to keep their roots in that upper surface. What you want to try to do is encourage deep rooting by deep watering. And it turns out that the soil here is so deep that it can store a tremendous amount of water. So it may look like on the surface that it's dry, but if you just take your shovel and go underneath a little bit, as an example here, you can see there's still moisture. And so there would be no need to water this. So the tips that we have for watering are, first of all, do not water in the middle of the day. Only water in the evening or the morning. And the second thing is use methods such as soaker hoses or drip irrigation system that you can get a deep, infrequent watering. And so this again is a good example here of somebody that's installed a drip system. I use soaker hoses on my plot. And the other nice thing about it is it really saves a lot of time. So I typically water twice a week. I come in, turn my soaker hoses on for about an hour, and then come back and turn them off. And that's all I need. So I don't need to spend hours waving a wand around and losing a lot of water by evaporation. So it's important to be able to gauge by digging down a little bit and seeing whether or not you need that water, and then use these methods that can conserve water, especially drip irrigation and also the soaker hose. The drip irrigation is absolutely the most efficient in terms of water usage. So this year may turn out to be another dry year. We've had an extremely dry spring, and so if we get hot temperatures and we're not careful, we're going to run the water bill up and cause more problems. So water conservation is very important. I'd like to talk about how our volunteer system is set up. And as I mentioned before, it's important that all growers do some common work, or all gardeners rather, at least a few hours a month to try to get things done. So we've actually set up a number of committees. First is what we call the Mowing and Path Maintenance Committee. And they're the ones that will mow the grass here, keep the paths weeded. And so all these things are going to be set up on Sign Up Genius so that you can join these different committees. Second committee we set up is a rototilling committee. Last year when we got our rototill, we just let all the gardeners use it at will, and they kept breaking, and we just had all sorts of problems. So we decided instead to do it by a committee, and we are charging a little bit to do that, but essentially if you pay that fee, you get your plot rototilled. And then as an incentive, the people that rototill will take charges off their plot fees. So there's an incentive all the way around to try to get this done. The third committee that we've set up is the shed committee, and you can probably see from the pictures that the shed is a bit disorganized right now. And that committee keeps things organized and tidies up the shed over the season. The next committee that we have is the compost committee, but that won't be working until we get all the windrows turned and everything. But the whole idea behind that is just to make sure that people are keeping the debris right on the plot. Another very important committee is our food bank committee, and I did not mention that this garden over the last 20 or more years has made a real commitment to the community in terms of food security and food bank gardens. So Community Action Center has a food bank, and for many years they've operated 4 plots that we've given to them for free. In fact, one of them's over here and one of them's there. We can look at those later. And in the past they had staff that would keep those up, but with COVID they didn't. And so we started a program that would offer free plots to low-income gardeners. And we did have some of those last year. And what will happen is if we don't get any of those, we'll get other service groups to come in and work these plots. But all the gardeners can also participate in that effort. We also have Backyard Harvest has been here for many years. They've got about 3 or 4 plots, and we can film some of those later just to show you those. And then the Center for Civic Engagement also has some plots that are all dedicated to food bank. So that can also be one of your volunteer efforts. Now, another committee that was very active until COVID was the Spring Fair Committee. And normally on the second Saturday of May after graduation, we would have our Spring Fair open house and plant sale. And we would have community groups mainly focused around the environment and science, things such as the Humane Society, Palouse Audubon Society, the Master Gardeners, of course the Palouse Conservation District. Lots of groups would come down here and have a table and share their information with the public. And then we also had a plant sale, and then also plants on consignment from SYG. And so that was usually a big event that would go from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock, and that took a lot of planning. And I'm hoping that next year we will be back in person so that we can do that. And then the other committee that we're going to see if we can get started is the social committee. And this was, again, taken out by COVID last year. We would have potlucks under the picnic structure here once a month, and then have an educational talk. And that allowed people to interact and have social activities. So we hope to be able to get that one put together. And then finally, I just want to mention lots of different educational opportunities that we've worked with different groups over the years. School districts, Upward Bound, 4-H, different groups to do educational things down here. So we hope we can do that again. And then I'll put a plug in for Palouse Conservation District's a set of webinars which they have been putting together, which is also serving a good educational thing. In fact, I did one on plant diseases a few weeks ago. So that wraps up our video. Again, the community garden is a resource for the entire community, and I invite anyone to walk around, ride by the trail, visit the garden. And also, if you're interested in gardening, contact us at our Gmail, koppelgardens@gmail.com, or you can visit our website to get more information. And I'd especially like to thank again all the community groups that have made this possible throughout the years for your funding and support and continued support. So we look forward to a lot of great things happening in the community garden.